The air inside the restaurant was thick with the scent of sterile floor wax and expensive, untouched appetizers until Kendra Lawson broke the silence. In a city where status was worn like armor, the elderly man sitting at table 4 was a walking wound. His suit, though made of silk that cost more than Kendra's annual rent, was stained with the dust of a long, aimless trek through Seoul's winding alleys. He sat with a hollow gaze, his hands trembling, not from age, but from the crushing weight of a memory he couldn't quite catch. Kendra watched from the server station as the restaurant manager's face curdled with disgust. To the manager, this wasn't a man. He was a liability, a blemish on the establishment's polished reputation. As the manager reached for the telephone to summon security and have the nuisance removed, Kendra's hand moved faster. She pressed her palm over the receiver, her dark eyes locking onto his with a quiet, New Orleans-bred fire that brooked no argument. "I'll handle it," she murmured, her voice a low velvet contrast to the manager's frantic energy. Kendra didn't approach him with a bill or a warning. Instead, she retreated to the kitchen and ladled a bowl of the chef's private stock, a rich, marrow-deep broth that smelled of home and healing. When she set it before the old man, the ivory steam curled around his weathered face like a ghost. "Eat, sir," she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear. "The world can wait until you're full." For the first time in hours, Jae-Ho Kim's eyes focused. He looked at the woman before him, the only soul in a city of millions who saw a person instead of a problem. He took a single sip, the warmth blooming in his chest, unaware that his presence here had already set the city on fire. At that very moment, 3 miles away, a silent war was moving through the streets. A fleet of 30 obsidian SUVs tore through the rain, led by Sung-Hoon Lee, the most feared man in the country. He would burn every bridge in Seoul to find his father, but he never expected to find him in the care of a woman whose kindness was more powerful than any syndicate weapon. Kendra thought she was just serving a meal. She didn't realize she was becoming the centerpiece of a family portrait painted in blood and secrets. By tomorrow, this act of grace would be the only thing keeping her alive. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe if you're new here. The lunchtime rush at the Gilded Lily usually felt like a battlefield where the weapons were silver spoons and the casualties were dignity. It was a place of sharp angles and cold surfaces, where the clinking of crystal drowned out anything resembling a soul. Kendra Lawson wiped down the marble station for the 10th time that hour, her movements fluid and practiced, a rhythm she had perfected to keep the isolation of Seoul from settling in her bones. She was a New Orleans girl in a city of neon and glass, a woman who knew that a well-seasoned pot could bridge the distance between two worlds. Then the door chimed, a light, delicate sound that felt heavy when the old man stepped through. He didn't look like he belonged in a place that charged $50 for a side of kimchi. His suit was fine wool, but it was crumpled, hanging off his frame as if he had been shrinking inside it for miles. He didn't wait to be seated. He simply wandered to table 4, the one with the best view of the Han River, and sat down with the slow, deliberate exhaustion of a man who had finally reached the edge of the world. Kendra's manager, a man named Park whose suit was always 2 sizes too tight for his ego, hissed from the host stand. "Kendra, get him out. He's disoriented. He'll scare the regulars." Kendra didn't answer. She looked at the old man, Jae-Ho Kim, though she didn't know his name yet. She saw the way his hands rested on the table, open, empty, and trembling. He wasn't looking at the menu. He was looking through the table, his eyes milky with a grief so ancient it felt like it had its own weather system. She walked over, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She didn't bring a menu. She didn't ask for a credit card. Instead, she knelt slightly so she was at eye level with him. "You look like you've been walking a long time, sir," she said, her voice a low, warm hum. Jae-Ho blinked, his focus snapping to her face. He saw the deep mahogany of her skin, the kindness in her gaze that didn't belong in this sterile room. I can't find the way," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "The house with the blue gate, it's gone." "Sometimes the road moves on us," Kendra replied softly, "but the kitchen stays the same." She disappeared into the back, ignoring Park's frantic gesturing. She didn't order from the line. Instead, she took a small pot from the back burner, something she'd been simmering for herself, a fusion of her grandmother's soul food techniques and the local ingredients she'd grown to love. It was a beef brisket soup, darkened with charred onions and deepened with a hint of spice that bloomed at the back of the throat. When she placed the bowl in front of him, the steam rose in a fragrant cloud. Jae-Ho closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. For a moment, the restaurant vanished. The clink of silverware was replaced by the ghost of a woman's laughter and the sound of a blue gate creaking in the wind. He took a spoonful, and the warmth hit his chest like a long-awaited homecoming. "It tastes like before," he murmured, a single tear carving a path through the dust on his cheek. Kendra stood by him, a silent sentry. She didn't know that this man's son was currently tearing the city apart looking for him. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, she wasn't just a waitress in a foreign land. She was a healer, and the man at table 4 was finally, if only for a moment, no longer lost. The peace in the restaurant was brittle, held together only by the rising steam of the brisket soup and the rhythmic sound of Jae-Ho's spoon hitting the ceramic bowl. Kendra stood a few feet back, watching the tension drain from the old man's shoulders. For a moment, the world felt small and safe, confined to the circle of warmth at table 4. Then the silence outside died. It began as a low hum, a vibration that rattled the glass jars on Kendra's counter. Then came the screech of tires, synchronized and sharp, cutting through the rainy Seoul afternoon like a blade. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, 3 obsidian-black SUVs swerved to a halt, blocking the street. Men in charcoal suits spilled out with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, their faces masks of professional aggression. Kendra's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move. She had seen men like this back home, men who carried violence in the way they breathed, but these were different. They moved with the cold, expensive authority of a private army. At the center of the storm was Sung-Hoon Lee. He stepped out of the lead vehicle, his presence darkening the room before he even crossed the threshold. He didn't look like a man searching for a father. He looked like a god preparing to exact a debt. His overcoat billowed behind him, and his eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the interior of the gilded lily with lethal efficiency. The door burst open, the delicate chime nearly snapping under the force. Sung-Hoon stepped inside, his hand already reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket, his jaw set in a line of iron. Behind him, 2 guards moved to flank the entrance, their shadows stretching long across the polished floor. "Move," Sung-Hoon commanded, his voice a low, jagged rasp that sent a chill down Kendra's spine. He was looking toward table 4, his body coiled to strike, ready to seize his father and punish whoever had dared to keep him. But then he stopped. The violence didn't leave him, it just froze. Sung-Hoon's gaze landed on the back of the elderly man's head. He saw his father, a man who had spent the last year screaming at shadows and refusing to eat, sitting perfectly still. He saw the way Jae-Ho was tilting his head, listening to the soft New Orleans jazz Kendra had put on the speakers. He saw the empty soup bowl and the way his father's hand was resting, not in a fist, but open on the white linen. Kendra took a cautious step forward, placing herself subtly between the armed men and the old man's piece. She met Sung-Hoon's eyes. She didn't flinch. In that look, she didn't offer a challenge. She offered a sanctuary. Sung-Hoon looked from the waitress to his father. The air in the room, which had been charged with the threat of gunfire and shattered glass, suddenly grew heavy with a different kind of weight. He watched a single tear of relief track down his father's face as the old man hummed a broken tune. Slowly, Sung-Hoon's hand slipped out of his jacket. He signaled to his men with a curt, almost imperceptible wave of his fingers. They retreated a step. The lethal energy of the room exhaling in a long, shaky breath. The ruthless leader of the Lee Syndicate stood in the doorway of a simple restaurant, silenced by the one thing his money couldn't buy, his father's quiet. He didn't speak. He just watched Kendra, his expression shifting from a predator's snarl to a look of profound, dangerous curiosity. The following morning, the rain had cleared, leaving Seoul draped in a thin, translucent fog that made the skyscrapers look like teeth rising through milk. Kendra was at the restaurant early, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm of prepping the day's aromatics, but her mind was back at table 4. The memory of the man with the predator's eyes and the broken father's heart was a weight she couldn't shake. The chime of the door didn't herald a customer. Instead, 2 men in tailored charcoal suits stepped in, moving with a synchronized gravity that immediately sucked the air out of the room. They didn't sit. They stood by the door, silent as pillars, until a 3rd man entered. It wasn't Sung-Hoon Lee, but his shadow, a man with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like a precision-cut diamond. "Miss Lawson," the man said, offering a bow that was technically perfect but entirely devoid of warmth. "I am Mr. Han. My employer would like to express his gratitude for your intervention yesterday." He placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the counter. Kendra didn't touch it. She looked at Mr. Han, her chin tilted up. He's his father. He shouldn't need an intervention to see that the man was hurting. Mr. Han's expression didn't flicker. Many people see the chairman's pain. No one has been able to soothe it. Until you, he gestured toward the envelope. Inside is a contract. Mr. Lee is offering you a position as the chairman's private live-in caregiver at the estate. Kendra glanced at the envelope. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Han. I don't have a medical degree." "The chairman does not need a doctor. He is surrounded by them. He needs the woman who made him feel like he was finally home. He has refused to eat since he was brought back last night. He is asking for the woman with the warm hands." Mr. Han paused, his gaze intensifying. "The salary is 10 times your current annual earnings, paid monthly. There is a signing bonus, a housing allowance, and full legal protection." The number on the first page of the contract made Kendra's breath hitch. It was a life-changing sum, a golden ticket out of her struggle, a way to finally plant roots that wouldn't be pulled up by the next wind. But as she looked at the heavy gold embossing on the stationery, a cold instinct shivered down her spine. It wasn't just a salary, it was a tether. It was the kind of money that didn't just buy your time, it bought your silence, your loyalty, and your soul. It was a cage, even if the bars were made of 24-karat gold. "Why me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the drumming of her heart. "There are thousands of professionals in this city." "Because," Mr. Han replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you are the only thing the most dangerous man in Korea cannot control with fear. And right now, you are the only thing his father loves." Kendra looked around the small, worn restaurant. She looked at her hands, still smelling of onions and cedarwood. She thought of Jae-Ho's tear-streaked face and the way Sung-Hoon had looked at her in the doorway, like she was a puzzle he intended to solve. She knew that by signing that paper, she was stepping out of the light and into a world of shadows. But as she reached for the pen Mr. Han held out, she realized she couldn't let that old man go back to being a ghost in his own home. She took the pen, the gold cool against her skin, and signed away her quiet life. The transition from the vibrant, sensory chaos of the city to the Lee estate felt like stepping into a vacuum. The fortress sat atop a jagged hill overlooking the Han River, a monolith of glass, steel, and weeping stone that seemed designed to keep the world out rather than invite anyone in. Kendra sat in the back of a silent sedan, her small suitcase looking out of place against the buttersoft leather seats. As the iron gates groaned open, she felt the weight of the golden summons pressing down on her chest. This wasn't a home. It was a monument to a grief that hadn't yet been buried. Mr. Han led her through the labyrinthine corridors with the clinical efficiency of a ghost. The air was chilled, stripped of the smells of cooking or life, replaced by the faint, metallic scent of industrial air filtration. They moved past original Picassos and Ming vases that stood like sentries in the dim light, until they reached the West Wing. "The chairman does not leave these rooms," Mr. Han whispered, his hand hovering over a heavy oak door. "And he does not allow the lights to be fully raised. He says the brightness hurts his memory." When Kendra stepped inside, the darkness was absolute for a heartbeat before her eyes adjusted to the flickering amber of a dozen low-burning candles. The room was vast, filled with the heavy silhouettes of antique furniture, but it felt cramped, crowded by the presence of the past. Jae-Ho Kim sat in a high-backed wing chair by the window, staring out at the river, though his reflection in the glass seemed more real to him than the landscape. The walls were not bare. They were covered in a singular obsession. Every available surface was draped with portraits, sketches, and photographs of a woman with a luminous smile and eyes that mirrored the chairman's own. This was the ghost that haunted the West Wing, the late matriarch of the Lee Empire. "You brought the scent of the rain with you," Jae-Ho said, his voice a rasping thread in the gloom. He didn't turn around. "And the smell of that soup. It's the only thing that doesn't taste like ash lately." Kendra walked toward him, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She noticed that a small table beside him was cluttered with half-empty teacups and cold porridge, untouched and gray. Beside the tray lay a broken pearl necklace, the white beads scattered across the mahogany like fallen teeth. "I brought more than a cent, sir," Kendra said softly, kneeling beside his chair. She didn't turn on the lamps. She respected the shadows he had built. "I brought the promise that we're going to find that blue gate again, even if we have to build it ourselves." Jae-Ho finally turned his head. In the candlelight, his face looked like a map of a war-torn country. He reached out a trembling hand, touching the sleeve of Kendra's coat as if to verify she wasn't another hallucination. "The gate is locked," he whispered, his eyes darting to a large oil painting of his wife that hung above the fireplace. "I lost the key the night the stairs took her. I was holding her hand, Kendra. I was holding her. And then I wasn't." Kendra felt a cold shiver of intuition. The way he looked at the painting wasn't just with love, it was with a profound, soul-deep terror. He wasn't just mourning her, he was hiding from the moment she died. As she took his hand, her gaze drifted to the staircase depicted in the background of the portrait, the very same marble stairs she had passed in the foyer. The secrets of this house were buried in the silence between his words, and Kendra realized that to save the father, she would have to exhume the truth the son was too afraid to face. The nights in the Lee estate were louder than the days. While the sun was up, the house maintained a tomb-like stillness, but once the shadows stretched across the West Wing, the architecture itself seemed to groan under the weight of its history. Kendra sat in the armchair outside Jae-Ho's bedroom, the door cracked just enough to hear the steady, rhythmic rasp of the old man's breathing. He had finally fallen into a deep sleep, aided by a cup of lavender-infused tea and the low, melodic humming of a song Kendra remembered from her childhood in the bayou. Around midnight, the heavy silence of the corridor was punctured by the sharp click of heels on marble. Kendra froze. These weren't the measured, ghost-like steps of the domestic staff. These were the strides of men who owned the floor they walked upon. She stood, pressing herself into the deep shadows of the recessed doorway as two figures emerged from the grand library down the hall. Sung-hoon was there, his silhouette jagged and tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Beside him was a man Kendra had seen in several family photographs, Jae-Ho, Sung-hoon's childhood friend and the Syndicate's chief strategist. In the photos, Jae-Ho's smile was wide and fraternal, but in the dim moonlight of the hallway, his face was a mask of calculated iron. "You're letting him indulge in these fantasies, Sung-hoon," Jae-Ho's voice hissed, low but vibrating with a strange, frantic energy. "Bringing that woman here. Letting him talk about the night, it's dangerous. For the organization. For you." "He's my father, Jae-Ho," Sung-hoon replied, his voice a dangerous rumble. "He's starving in the dark. If she can make him eat, if she can make him sleep, then she stays." "He isn't just sleeping," Jae-Ho countered, stepping closer until he was inches from the boss's face. "He's remembering, or at least he thinks he is. You know what the doctors said, his mind is a labyrinth of trauma. He's convinced himself he was there on the stairs, that he let her go. Why would you want to stir that up? We buried that tragedy years ago. We found the faulty railing. We closed the case." "Then why does he cry out for her to stop?" Sung-hoon's voice cracked, a rare moment of raw vulnerability that made Kendra's heart ache. "Why does he say he saw a shadow that wasn't his own?" Jae-Ho let out a sharp, dismissive breath that sounded like a snarl. "Old men see shadows everywhere. He's a liability, Sung-hoon. If the other families think the great chairman has lost his mind and is accusing his own shadows of murder, they'll move on us. I'm telling you as your friend, the one who stood by you while you watched her fall, keep him quiet, or I'll have to do it for you." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Sung-hoon didn't move, but the atmosphere around him turned lethal. Jae-Ho didn't wait for a response. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the East Wing, leaving the boss standing alone under a portrait of his mother. Kendra pulled back into the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked at Jae-Ho, peaceful in his sleep, and realized with a terrifying clarity that the old man wasn't just haunted by a ghost. He was being hunted by the living. The mistake he carried wasn't a failure of his hands, but a secret someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. And now, simply by listening, Kendra was part of the secret too. The storm that had been brewing in the atmosphere finally broke over the estate, lashing the glass walls of the West Wing with a violence that mirrored the chaos unfolding inside. Jae-Ho was caught in the throes of a waking nightmare, his thin frame thrashing against the silk sheets as he spiraled into a feverish delirium. Kendra pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, her heart aching as he whimpered, his voice cracking with a guilt that had been fermented by years of silence. "I held her. I felt her fingers slip," he wailed, his eyes wide but unseeing, fixed on the ceiling as if the scene were playing out above him. "The marble was so cold. I tried to pull her back, but I was too weak. I killed her, Kendra, my hands." They let her go. He gripped Kendra's wrists with surprising strength, his knuckles white. "Tell Sung-hoon. Tell him his father is a murderer. I pushed her away from the ledge, but she fell. She fell because of me." Kendra stayed with him, her voice a low, steady anchor in his storm, but her mind was racing. She looked toward the grand oil painting above the mantel, the one Jae-Ho stared at for hours every day. In his delirium, he kept describing the slip, the way her hand had slid from his right hand as he reached out from the top of the stairs. She stood up, leaving him for a brief second to move closer to the portrait. It was a masterpiece of realism, capturing the late matriarch in a moment of candid joy. But Kendra wasn't looking at the woman's face. She was looking at her jewelry. In the painting, the woman wore the same pearl necklace Kendra had seen broken on the bedside table. But she also wore a heavy, distinctive gold watch on her right wrist, a watch that Jae-Ho had mentioned she never took off because it had been a gift from her father. Kendra's breath hitched. She remembered the official police report she had glimpsed in the library. The one Jae-Ho had insisted was closed. It mentioned the fall occurred on the right side of the grand staircase. If Jae-Ho had been reaching with his right hand to catch her, as he claimed in his guilt, he would have been standing on the left. But more importantly, Jae-Ho's left arm had been in a cast that month due to a minor stroke, a detail Kendra had found in his medical files earlier that morning. She looked back at the broken pearls on the nightstand. They weren't just scattered, they were crushed, as if someone had stepped on them with a heavy boot. If Jae-Ho had truly been holding her hand, the pearls wouldn't be under a boot print, they would be in his palm. "You didn't let her go," Kendra whispered, turning back to the trembling man. "You couldn't have." She realized then that Jae-Ho's memory had been systematically poisoned. He wasn't remembering a mistake. He was remembering a story someone had told him over and over until he owned it. The detail in the portrait, the position of the watch and the side of the stairs, proved that the physics of his confession were impossible. He had been a witness, not a participant, and the shadow he saw wasn't a hallucination. It was the person who had actually been standing close enough to break those pearls. Kendra looked at the closed door, the weight of the truth chilling her blood. The man Jae-Ho called his son's best friend hadn't just covered up a murder. He had stolen a man's sanity to hide it. The truth was a heavy thing, but Kendra knew how to carry it. Growing up in a house where the walls were thin and the neighborhood was loud, she had learned to see the world through the corner of her eye. She possessed the eyes in the back of her head, common to all great waitresses, an instinct for the shift in a room's temperature, the way a shoulder tensed before a glass was dropped, or the flicker of a lie before it left a mouth. For the next 2 days, Kendra became a shadow within the Lee estate. While she continued to bring Jae-Ho his infusions and read to him in the dim amber light, her focus was pinned on Jae-Ho. She watched him from the upper balcony as he arrived each morning, nodding the way he smoothed his tie before entering Sung-hoon's office, a gesture that was less about vanity and more about armor. She watched him interact with the security staff, noticing how they deferred to him not with respect, but with a wary, animal-like caution. She waited until a Tuesday afternoon, when the house felt hollowed out by a sudden business summit in the city center. Sung-hoon was gone, and Jae-Ho was reportedly in the East Wing's gym. Kendra slipped out of the West Wing, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold marble. She didn't go to the files or the computers. She went to the scene of the accident. The grand staircase was a masterpiece of curved white stone, beautiful and lethal. Kendra stood at the top, exactly where Jae-Ho's memory placed him. She looked down at the polished surface. According to the official report, the railing had given way under the matriarch's weight. But as Kendra knelt, running her fingers along the ornate gold leaf of the balustrade, she saw the truth in the wood. The wood wasn't rotten. Under the fresh coat of lacquer used for the repairs, there were jagged indentations, deep, sharp gouges that didn't come from a body leaning against a rail. They were the marks of a struggle, the kind made by a heavy ring or a metal watch band scraping against the grain as someone fought to stay upright. Kendra moved lower, her eyes scanning the base of the spindles. In a narrow crevice where the stone met the wood, something caught the light. She reached in with a pair of tweezers she'd carried in her pocket. It was a single, tiny fragment of obsidian, a shard from a cufflink. She remembered the family photo again. Jae-Ho never wore obsidian. He preferred the soft glow of jade. But Jae-Ho, the best friend who had stood by Sung-hoon's side that night, was known for his collection of black volcanic glass. A floorboard groaned behind her. Kendra didn't turn around immediately. She closed her hand over the shard, her heart a drum against her ribs. She used the reflection in the glass of a nearby landscape painting to see the hallway behind her. Jae-Ho was standing at the end of the corridor, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes fixed on her back. He wasn't sweating. He was watching her with the same clinical, predatory stillness she had seen in her nightmares. "The stairs are dangerous, Miss Lawson," he said, his voice a smooth, terrifying silk. "People who spend too much time looking at them tend to lose their footing." Kendra stood up slowly, her face a mask of professional calm. "I was just checking for dust, sir. The chairman says the house feels dirty lately." She walked past him, her heart hammering, the sharp edge of the obsidian shard cutting into her palm, the physical weight of a murder confession. The obsidian shard felt like a live coal against Kendra's palm as she stood before the heavy mahogany doors of Sung-hoon's private study. The house was unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that precedes a landslide. She didn't knock. She simply pushed the doors open, her breath coming in steady, rhythmic draws. Sung-hoon was silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seoul skyline bleeding neon light onto his tailored shoulders. He didn't turn when she entered. "I told Mr. Han I wasn't to be disturbed, Kendra." "Your father isn't crazy, Sung-hoon," Kendra said, her voice cutting through the gloom like a bell. "And he isn't a murderer." That got his attention. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in her disheveled hair and the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. Kendra walked to his desk and opened her hand. The black shard of volcanic glass tumbled onto the green blotter, looking like a drop of dried blood. "I found this embedded in the staircase, near the gouges in the wood where your mother fought for her life," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Your father thinks he let her go because someone spent years whispering that lie into his ear. But a man with a cast on his left arm couldn't have been standing where he remembers. This shard didn't come from his jewelry. It came from the cufflinks Jae-Ho wore that night." The air in the room vanished. Sung-hoon stared at the stone, his face becoming a mask of absolute, terrifying stillness. "You're overstepping, Waitress," a voice hissed from the shadows near the bookshelves. Jae-Ho stepped into the light. He wasn't smiling anymore. His composure had stripped away, revealing something jagged and desperate underneath. He looked at the shard, then at Sung-hoon. "She's a foreigner, Sung-hoon. She's trying to sow discord because she wants a bigger payout. You're going to believe a servant over the man who bled with you in the streets." "The servant is the only one who fed my father when he was starving," Sung-hoon murmured, his voice so quiet it was more frightening than a shout. Jae-Ho's hand moved toward his waistband, his eyes darting to the door. "She's a liability. She's poisoned your head just like she did the old man's." He lunged toward Kendra, his fingers reaching for her throat to silence the truth once and for all. Kendra didn't flinch. She had stood her ground in the toughest wards of New Orleans. She wasn't about to break in a Sutan Thai fortress, but she didn't have to move. In a blur of motion, Sung-hoon was there. He intercepted Jae-Ho with a violence that was silent and surgical. He caught Jae-Ho's wrist in a grip that sounded like grinding stone, forcing him to his knees. The Mafia Boss leaned down, his face inches from his oldest friend. "You watched me mourn her for a decade," Sung-hoon whispered, his eyes glowing with a lethal, cold fire. "You watched my father wither into a ghost, all while wearing the evidence of your cowardice on your sleeves." Jae-Ho gasped, his face contorting in pain. It was a mistake, Sung-hoon. She heard me talking to the BK group. She was going to tell you. I just pushed her to stop her from leaving." "A mistake is dropping a glass, Jae-Ho," Sung-hoon said, his voice devoid of all humanity. "What you did was a death sentence." He signaled to the guards who appeared like specters in the doorway. As they dragged the screaming man out into the darkness of the east wing, Sung-hoon remained standing over the obsidian shard. He looked at Kendra, and for the first time the predator's mask was gone. There was only a son, standing in the ruins of a 10-year lie, looking at the woman who had finally brought the light. The heavy, suffocating silence that had defined the Lee estate for a decade didn't shatter. It dissolved. In its place was a quiet that felt like a long-awaited exhale. A week had passed since the night the obsidian shard was laid on the mahogany desk, and the house felt different, lighter, as if the very stones had been scrubbed of a century of soot. Kendra stood in the center of the grand dining room, but the long, intimidating banquet table remained empty. Instead, she had set a small, intimate round table by the glass doors that opened toward the river. There were no white linens or silver candelabras tonight. Instead, there was the scent of thyme, garlic, and slow-simmered rue, the fragrance of a woman who had finally stopped running and started planting roots. Jae-Ho sat at the table, his posture straighter than Kendra had ever seen it. He wore a simple linen shirt, and the haunted, milky haze in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, clear grief, a pain he could finally name, and therefore, a pain he could finally begin to heal. Beside him sat Sung-hoon. The Mafia Boss had traded his armored charcoal suit for a dark sweater, his hands resting motionless on the table. For the first time, he wasn't looking for an enemy in the shadows. He was looking at his father. Kendra placed the final dish in the center, a steaming pot of gumbo, dark and rich, served alongside bowls of perfectly seasoned rice. "The truth is a hard meal to swallow," Kendra said softly, her voice carrying the warmth of the kitchen. "But it's the only thing that keeps you from starving." Jae-Ho reached out, not for the food, but for his son's hand. Sung-hoon hesitated for a heartbeat before closing his fingers around his father's. It was a bridge built over a decade of lies, a silent pact between the two men who had been kept apart by a ghost that wasn't theirs to carry. "It wasn't me, Sung-hoon," Jae-Ho whispered, his voice steady. "I didn't let her go." "I know, father," Sung-hoon replied, his voice thick with a raw, human emotion he usually kept buried under layers of ice. He looked up at Kendra, his gaze lingering on her with a profound, quiet respect. "We both know now." The following morning, Kendra returned to the small restaurant in the city one last time. She didn't go to pick up a shift. She went to hand her apron to the manager who had once tried to call security on a king in rags. She felt no bitterness, only a strange sense of closure. Just a waitress, who had felt invisible in the neon sprawl of Seoul, had found her power in a bowl of soup and a shard of glass. As she stepped back into the black sedan waiting at the curb, she saw Mr. Han holding the door. He didn't bow with his usual clinical coldness. He offered a small, genuine nod of welcome. Kendra looked up at the hill where the Lee estate sat, no longer a fortress of secrets, but a home in the making. She was no longer a temporary hire or a displaced traveler. She was the cornerstone, the warmth that kept the shadows at bay and the truth that kept the family whole. As the car pulled away, Kendra Lawson didn't look back. She was finally going home.